If you're looking to step into professional videography or photography, two of the budget mirrorless cameras you might be looking at might be the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II and the recently released NikoN Z50 Mark II. Which one is better? Let's find out. Now, before we start, just to set the scene, what this review will and will not be, it's not going to be a technical video that talks about technical specs of both cameras, nor will it compare per se the image or video quality of both. And now I know these are cameras and primarily you'd be concerned with the image quality. However, I do think both of them offer great image quality, great video quality, and the target audience for these cameras is not going to be professional photographers or videographers who would be more interested in how the sensors compare, the image quality, the color accuracy, the sharpness, etc. But these cameras target more beginners or amateurs in photography who probably, in my opinion at least, you might disagree, really concern themselves with head-to-head comparison between these two sensors and the more technical details. Whichever of these two cameras you use, you're going to get really, really good photos and videos. And that's why this review is not going to take that technical route, but rather it's going to be sharing my thoughts on both cameras for the general population and in a more simplified way. And if that's not what you're looking for, feel free to close this video, and I'm sure there's a ton of others on YouTube that might answer the questions that you might have. So let's start with what is similar between these two cameras. And I think they're both designed for video creators, but more so the Sony than the Nikon, and I'll tell you why in just a bit. When I say designed for video creation, well, both of them have fully articulating screens so that when you mount these on a tripod, you can actually flip out the screen and see yourself. They both, as you can see, have a red border around the screen to let you know that they're recording, but also this red tally light up front, which lets you know that you're recording whenever you're facing the camera, which is really nice to have. They both connect via USB-C, which is also good. And this means that in theory, you can get unlimited power with these, not relying on the internal battery. But also the USB-C connection means you can connect these to your computer and use them as webcams or high quality webcams to stream or record directly to your computers. They also both support, in theory, unlimited recording time. Now, in practice, it's not going to be unlimited because you need to factor in your battery, but also the memory card and also heating. So at some point the cameras are going to overheat and shut off, but they do not have that 30-minute recording limit that the predecessor for the NikoN Z50 so the Mark I had. And they're both able to shoot in log profiles, the S-Log3 for the Sony and the N-Log for the Nikon. Now, because they also have videography in mind, they both have product showcase mode. And this is a kind of autofocus that does not lock in on your eyes and keeps those in focus, but rather on the closest object to the camera. So if you hold something up like this in front of a camera, as you can see, it focuses on that. When you move it out of frame, it focuses back on you. And this is very important, especially for content creators, because, well, often they need to show you things. And without this feature, the autofocus is going to keep locked in on the eyes or the face, and it's not going to focus well on the object in front of the camera. Now, the difference here is that the Sony has a dedicated button over here for the product showcase mode. And as you can see, you can turn it on or off with the press of a button. Whereas with the Nikon, they don't have a dedicated button for this. You need to go into the menu and turn on the product review mode on or off. This is about all that they have in common. Now let's talk about what is different about these two. Speaking of dedicated buttons, the Sony has another one over here, which is called background defocus. It defocuses or blurs out the background. As you can see behind me, for example, things in the lights and everything is blurred out. This is called bokeh. And the easiest way to achieve bokeh is you open up your aperture to the widest setting. So you go to the largest aperture setting that your lens allows. And simply what the button on the Sony does is exactly that. It just opens the aperture to the widest setting. So it's easy and convenient for beginners who don't know yet much about camera settings, but it's very easy to do without the button. So on the Nikon, for example, that does not have it, you can go to the A mode, and this is the aperture priority mode. And as you can see over here, it is currently set at 3.5, which is the widest aperture for the kit lens. But essentially, when you set it at the lowest setting and aperture priority mode, the camera is going to automatically adjust the other setting, like the shutter speed, and essentially give you that background defocus. So It's good to have for beginners. It's an easy way to defocus your background, but in my opinion, it's not very essential. But now it gets more interesting. And the first thing you notice between these two is the size difference. So the Nikon is, I would say, significantly larger and bulkier than the Sony. So that's one point in favor of the Sony. It's way more compact and way lighter than the Nikon. However, the Nikon has something essential, in my opinion, that the Sony does not have, and it is this thing over here, which is called an EVF. That's the electronic viewfinder, and this is what you put to your eye if you want to take photos. And this is what makes the Nikon more of a hybrid camera that's geared for videography, but also photography, or at least more so than the Sony. And that's not to say you cannot take photos with the Sony, but you're better off if you're taking photos having an EVF. Another difference in favor of the Nikon for photography is the fact that it has a mechanical shutter, whereas the Sony does not, only has an electronic shutter. And this is more important if you're taking pictures of fast moving objects, for example. And essentially this is a mechanical shutter. That sound that you actually hear is the physical shutter opening and closing, whereas with the Sony, since there's no mechanical shutter, you do not hear that sound. Now, they do have a sound that mimics a shutter sound, but this is a purely digital or fake sound. The other thing the Nikon has that makes it more of a photography camera as well is a built-in flash over here, which the Sony does not. The Nikon also has the PASM dial over here, which lets you very easily and conveniently set different settings. So you can go from the program mode, the shutter, aperture priority, or manual, and custom settings as well. Whereas with the Sony, you don't have that dial and you need to fidget through the settings or the menu to get to these places. So all of these make the Nikon better suited for photography than the Sony that is better suited for videography. And speaking of videography, more points in favor of the Sony for videos. Firstly, it has this selector over here that lets you select between photos, videos, or S&Q, which stands for slow and quick. And this lets you either shoot slow motion or time-lapse videos easily. The Nikon does not have that selector. Another point in favor of the Sony in video mode, they both can do 4K at 60 frames per second. However, the Nikon has a ridiculous 1.5 times crop when you're shooting at 4K 60, which is a lot, especially given the fact that these both are APS-C sensors. So they already have a 1.5 times crop from full frame. And then there's another 1.5 crop at 60 frames per second with the Nikon. With the Sony, there's a very small crop. It's less than 1.1, so it's barely noticeable, and this is a point in favor of the Sony if, again, you're interested in video shooting. And another video-centric feature that is found on the Sony and not on the Nikon, you've got power zoom over here if you have a power zoom lens, and this lets you zoom in and zoom out electronically, essentially, without you manually having to zoom. The Nikon does not have that feature. The Nikon has the same sensor that was on the NikoN Z50 Mark 1, which is a couple years old. It's a 20.9 megapixel sensor, whereas the Sony has a 26 megapixel sensor. Now, I wouldn't say particularly this is of great importance because, as I said, whichever camera you use, you're not going to be disappointed with the picture quality, but it's just worth mentioning. And lastly, in terms of autofocus, now the Z50 Mark II has improved autofocus from the predecessor, the Z50 Mark I. It's significantly better. However, it still does not match the autofocus of the Sony, which has far more focus points and is more responsive, more accurate. Now, that's not to say that the autofocus in the Z50 Mark II is bad, but compared head to head to the Sony, the autofocus in the Sony camera is better. Having said that, the Z50 Mark II has more autofocus options, so you can actually select human, animal, bird, car, or plane, whereas with the Sony, you can only select human, animal, and bird. So that's it for me comparing these two cameras. Now, which one should you buy? I would say this boils down to whether you're going to predominantly use the camera for photography or videography. If the answer is photography, I would definitely say get the Nikon. It is much better suited for photography with the electronic viewfinder, with the mechanical shutter, and even with the different autofocus options. It is a better camera if you're going to predominantly do photography. If, however, you're going to do videography primarily, then I would say get the Sony. It does have better autofocus. The 4K at 60 frames per second is cropped much less. It does have power zoom, which could be beneficial if you're using a power zoom lens and you're doing videography. So in terms of videos, I would personally choose the Sony over the Nikon. Now, if you're going to do a equal split combination of videos and photos, then this might boil down to personal preference. To be honest, I've been a very long time Nikon user. Ever since my first point and shoot digital camera around 20 years ago was a Nikon Coolpix, and I've been using Nikon cameras since then. I only recently switched to the Sony ecosystem with the 6700, and to be honest, I'm happy with the switch. I thought I was going to have a hard time being used to the Nikon menus and all that, but to be honest, I actually found the Sony menus, the features, the customization options to be far better than what the Nikon allowed me with the Z50. So in terms of preference between the two, I do prefer what the Sony offers, especially with their new menus. But again, the best camera would be the one that works best for your use cases. So I hope at least in this video I was able to shed some light on what is similar between these two cameras and what sets them apart, in hopes it might facilitate or help you with your purchase decision. I will put product links to both cameras in the description. These are affiliate links, so if you do decide to purchase any of these cameras, I would appreciate it if you would use these links. I may earn some commission on some purchases at absolutely no extra cost to you, but this will greatly help support the channel. As always, if you liked the video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel, as this encourages me to continue producing content. Until next time, cheers.